Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of Cooking with Chef Jeff. Now, I'm Chef Jeff, and today we're going to be preparing a recipe from the Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen by Chef Sean Sherman and Beth Dooley in celebration of Native American Heritage Month. Now, Chef Sean Sherman is a Native American chef who likes to put a contemporary twist on classic Native American ingredients. The recipe we'll be preparing of his today is going to be rabbit braised with apples and mint. So, without further ado, let's get cooking. So the first thing we're going to do today is we're going to prepare a corn stock, and we're going to use the whole ear of corn, including the kernels. All right. And now what this stock is going to be is it's going to be a flavorful cooking liquid that we're going to use to cook the rabbit in. So the important thing here is we want to get as much flavor into this liquid as possible so that the rabbit tastes delicious. Now, something important with this stock, typically I would just use this central cob here in my stock because it's kind of the leftover. But in this case, I really want this stock to shine, so I'm going to use all of this here. All right, the entire thing is going to go in the pot. Now, you may ask yourself, Jeff, why did you cut all of that off the cob? Why not just throw the whole thing in there? The reason being is, if I were to boil this cob, it's going to take me hours to get all the flavor out of it. So by cutting it off, I expose all the internals of the corn, and now it's going to take a lot shorter, maybe 30 minutes to cook in total. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and add this corn to a pot of unsalted, simmering water. Now, the water being unsalted is important because if you were to salt it, the flavor would go from the water into the corn. But we want the flavor to go from the corn into the water, okay? So it's unsalted and it's simmering. So just a little bit below a boil. It just has some nice bubbles. Okay, and that's about a quart of water for that cob. In addition to the corn, I'm going to add a nice sprig of thyme. This actually came out of the garden just this morning. A clove of garlic, and all I did was took this and gave it a nice little whack with the knife just to break it open. Because we're going to be cooking it in this water, it doesn't need to be chopped up fancy. A fresh bay leaf, again, right out of the garden. And then here I've got half of a stalk of celery, as well as a half of carrot, just cut up roughly. You know, again, we're not going to see all the vegetables coming out of this, so it doesn't have to be beautiful. We're really trying to go for efficiency here. Now, something like a stock like this, I wouldn't be cooking it the same day that I'm preparing this braised rabbit. Typically, I'm going to have a whole, big tub of it ready to go in my cooler. But I wanted to give you guys a little bit of a demonstration here. So now that everything is in the pot here, we're just going to let those flavors meld, and it's going to become this beautiful, rich, silky, flavorful liquid that's really just going to help accent our nice, lovely rabbit we have. When I say that you want a gentle simmer, this is what you're looking for. You see how there are some nice, delicate bubbles coming up, but everything isn't being agitated and disturbed in the pot. You just want that 190 to 200 degree gentle simmer that's going to release all the flavors from the corn and the carrots, and celery, and the thyme, but that it's not going to make a really cloudy liquid. So now that our stock has been boiling or simmering for about the last 30 minutes, now we're going to strain it off because it's ready to go. I mean, it smells great. You can really smell that thyme, and the garlic, and the corn just perfuming the room. So what I'm going to do now is strain it off. And the reason behind this is, at this point, all we want is the liquid. That's where all the flavor's at. That's all we want. So I'm going to turn it off here. And I'm going to strain it through. This is called a French sieve or a fine mesh colander. It just picks up all the little particles and filters them out. It's like one of your home colanders, but much, much finer. And what you can do with the leftover stock, because we're only going to use a small amount of it for the braised rabbit, is you can actually make soup out of it. You can cook vegetables in it. There are plenty of things you can do with stock. But as you can see here, we just have a nice, wonderfully rich broth left over. So now I'm going to go ahead and just set this corn stock off to the side. We'll use it in a little bit. And the next step is going to be, we're going to be preparing a blue corn cake to go along with our rabbit. This is, you could even, for this, use something like a corn stock as a base. I'm going to stick with water because that is the recipe that Chef Sean wrote, so I'm going to stick true to what he's doing. So what I'll start with here is I've got 3 cups of water. Got a little bit of blue juniper ash. 1 cup of fine ground cornmeal. And a little bit of sunflower oil, all very traditional ingredients when you think of the Native American diet. Blue juniper ash was made from burning juniper. They would then take the ash, add it to things what makes everything really blue in color, even though right now it looks like a dark gray. Corn, it's one of the most synonymous ingredients with Native American cooking. Sunflower oil, I mean, what grows all over the United States? Sunflowers. Very common things that you don't really think of. So what we're going to do now is bring this 3 cups of water up to a boil. And whenever you're cooking like a cornmeal or polenta, as a lot of people know it as, you always are looking for like a 3-to-1 with your cornmeal to water. If you're going to be making more of like a cake like we're doing in this instance. If you were making more of like a soft cornmeal, soft polenta, you might go with more of a 4-to-1, a little closer to 4-to-1 wet ingredients to dry ingredients. But in this case, it's going to be solid, so we're going 3-to-1. So now that our water's come up to a boil, we're going to go ahead and add, first up, our blue juniper ash. And again, this It was pretty hard to find. I actually had to order it off of Etsy from a Native American producer. It's not something you're going to find in stores, but if you really want to make it very traditional, sometimes you gotta go the extra lengths. So now that this is boiling, I'm just going to stir in the blue juniper ash, and I'm going to go ahead and turn it again back down to a simmer. Reason being, I don't want to burn this cornmeal, and it will burn on the bottom very quickly. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in my cornmeal slowly while I'm whisking so that I don't get lumpy, because I want this to be nice and smooth, and I don't want there to be big clumps or anything like that. And this is going to take, I'm going to turn it down really low, and it's probably going to take about 20 to 30 minutes depending on how fine your cornmeal is ground. And so that's one of the reasons why we started this a little bit early, so that it was something that could kind of be happening while we're doing some of the rest of our cooking. So I've got this is going to be for my blue corn cakes once again. And I'm just going to let that come up to a simmer now that I've added everything. And once it comes up to a simmer, I'll just stir every, couple of minutes just to make sure that it doesn't burn on the bottom. And always remember, seasoning. While we didn't want to season our corn stock, we do want to make sure that this gets seasoned. A little bit of salt is all I'm going to add. That's all the recipe calls for. No black pepper. And the aromas coming off of the juniper ash are just very intense. Something I haven't really experienced before. I've made cornmeal plenty of times, but never with an ingredient like blue juniper ash. And what you'll see is this will start to thicken up while it's simmering, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's done. It's kind of like if you're used to cooking grits. Just because it starts to get thick doesn't mean they're done. The cornmeal's got to hydrate and cook all the way through, so you don't want to rush it. Because if you rush it, you're going to get a weird texture. It's going to be kind of gritty. Okay, so now we're simmering. I'm just going to turn it down a little bit. I just want this to cook ever so gently along the way, so I'm not burning it and I'm not getting any weird clumps. All right. I'm also going to go ahead and add my sunflower oil here. And again, this sunflower oil, it's a pretty neutral oil. It gives off a little bit of nuttiness, but it's not like olive oil where it's very grassy. This is more of a nutty taste. I'm just going to whisk that in. The aromas that are coming off of that are huge. Between the juniper ash and that sunflower oil, I mean, this room is just perfumed. All right, now we're just going to let that go. Don't really need to mess with it a whole lot. Now, while the cornmeal is cooking, we're going to go ahead and get started on our prep work for the main dish, the rabbit braised with apples and mint. Okay, and what we were going to want to start off with is a couple of apples, pretty self-explanatory. And while you're doing this, just don't forget, you want to give your cornmeal a stir every once in a while, just to make sure it doesn't burn on the pan. Okay, it's still looking good, it's just getting nice and thick. And what we're going to want to do with these apples is leave them in pretty big pieces, but we want to take the cores out. And these are specifically Envy apples. They're one of my favorites. They've got a nice sweet but also tart finish. They've got good firm flesh. They're going to be great for roasting in this particular situation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut each apple into quarters. And Once I cut them in the quarters, I'm just going to go ahead and take the core out. And I'm going to leave them in big chunks, just like this. And everybody always thinks, well, if you cook the apples for a long time, aren't they going to turn to mush? You know, just like apple pie. But the thing is, when you're cooking apples, how firm or how mushy they get really turns into what type of apple and how you cook them. So a firmer fleshed apple will typically hold up a little better, but also it's important that you don't move the apples around a lot while cooking them. If you don't move them around a lot, that's how they're going to stay in nice big chunks, and they're going to be great for our presentation. Just going to put these in the bowl off to the side for just a moment and clear off my board. So now that the apples are cut up, I was just looking at the cornmeal and it's looking good and thick, so I'm going to go ahead and pull it off the heat. And it's really how I can tell is when I run my my whisk along the bottom and it doesn't catch onto the pan, that's when you know it's good. And I'm also going to go ahead and get started on my rabbit, the main piece. I have a lovely rabbit here from the farmer's market, and it's a whole rabbit, bone in and all, which is exactly what we want for this recipe. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut it up into a few different pieces. That way it's manageable in our pot and for portioning. Now, when you look at a rabbit, it's going to be three main pieces. You're going to have your hind legs, you're going to have your front legs and chest, and then you're going to have what they call the saddle, which is this part right here. Okay? So let's go ahead. When I'm breaking down the rabbit, if you've ever cut up a chicken before, what you want to do is kind of separate your rear legs, run your knife in between where the joint is, just cut that leg off. So I'll try to show you again here. I'm going to pop the joint out of its socket, and then I'm going to run my leg along the muscle, where the muscle runs, and just cut straight through. And what I'm trying to achieve here is I'm trying to go through the bone or the joints with my knife, because that's where the bone is the softest. Okay. Do the same thing. I'm going to go ahead and cut the saddle off. And you don't have to have the sharpest knife in the world. What you're really looking for here is to use a little bit of the animal to your advantage. So I cut in between the bones, and then once I cut in between the bones, I pull it back a little bit to expose the in between the joints of the bones, and then I cut through there. And what I'm looking for with this saddle here is you've got these two tenderloins in the rabbit, just like you do in most animals. See here, they're right in the saddle. That's the part that we really want to make sure we get. I cut off if there's any sort of little fatty tissue or anything left over. I'm going to go ahead and trim that off. And now for the front legs, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to find the neck of the rabbit, and I'm going to go on either side with my knife, and I'm just going to start sawing down, and you should be able to go right through the rib cage. And then once you get a little bit through the rib cage, the rest of the leg and all the meat will come straight off of the rib cage. So it should be pretty easy. So see, I go through partially, and then the rest of the meat just pulls off of the rib cage. So you're left with, a little bit of flesh here and there, but almost all of it comes directly off. So when we take that whole rabbit, ultimately what we're left with is these two nice front legs, the two very meaty rear legs, and then you have a nice saddle. I'll probably end up cutting this in half, so that way when I go to portion, I can have one rear leg, one front leg, and one nice piece of saddle. That's what I'm thinking. So I'm just gonna, to cut this, I'm gonna go ahead and separate it a little bit. Now that the soft stuff is cut, I'm going to go ahead and bend the two sides, and that'll allow me to just cut through the backbone really easy. So there you have it. That way we broke down the rabbit pretty easy there. Obviously it'll take you a little longer at home, I'm sure. But just like with a chicken, these back legs, they're very meaty. They also are going to be very, very flavorful because the rabbit uses them a lot. And just like with any piece of the animal, the more the animal uses it, the more flavorful it's going to be. Now, the converse to that is the more flavorful it is, normally the more work that goes into cooking it, because you've got to cook it a little longer and make sure it's nice and tender. So now that we have the rabbit broken down, we're going to go ahead and sear it. And the point of this is to get some nice color on the outside. You know, you always hear people talk about, oh, you got to lock in the juices before you braise, but that's not what it has to do with. You really just want to make sure that you get the caramelization on the outside, because the caramelization of the meat is going to give you a lot of flavor. So I've got a nice heavy bottom pan, and I'm going to go ahead and add some more of the sunflower oil. And I just want to get that nice and hot. I want to start it over high heat, and then once it's in the pan, I'll turn it down a little bit so that it doesn't burn the rabbit. While the pan's heating up, I'm going to go ahead and season my rabbit generously with salt and black pepper. And I like fresh ground pepper. I don't like to use that stuff that's already pre-ground because most of it just tastes like sawdust. Fresh pepper should really awaken your senses. You can see my oil is starting to shimmer, and it's getting very, very light, which means it's ready. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start by putting my pieces in. That still sounds like it needs just a moment longer. I really want it to sizzle when I get it in the pan, because if it doesn't sizzle from the start, you're going to have a hard time getting the pan hot enough once everything's already in. So again, while I'm waiting for a second, I'm going to go ahead and sanitize my knife and my board. Just like anything, you know, rabbit is raw meat, and we want to make sure that we are very careful so we don't get anyone sick. If I was at home, I'd just go ahead and run this under hot, soapy water, but I don't quite have that option here. There we go. You see how my pan now is starting to smoke a little bit? That's perfect. That's the sound we're listening for. And I want as much surface contact in the pan as I can get, because the surface contact is where all the caramelization is going to occur, and that's flavor. And you noticed I seasoned the top side of the rabbit. I put all those sides down. Now I'm going to go ahead and season the bottom side. Gosh, it's been a while since I've cooked some whole rabbit, and I just forgot how the smell of it, again, just perfumes everything. And while that's searing, I don't want to touch it, I don't want to move it around, I just want to let it be. The more I move it around, the more likely that I'm going to disturb the caramelizing process, and you're just going to miss out on some flavor. It's not going to ruin the dish, but it's not going to be quite as nice as it could be. Let me check. See, I'm starting to get some nice color on there, that golden brown. It's exactly what I'm looking for. And as a professional chef, one of the most important things is working clean. You know, I don't want to get to the end of my cooking process and have to spend hours cleaning. And as my mom always said, cleanliness is next to godliness. Oh, look at all that. Look at that wonderful color there. Now, once this is seared on the other side, we're going to remove it from the pan. So, you know, and rabbit is one of those meats. It does need to be cooked all the way through, mostly because you're not really sure if your rabbit is domestic or wild, unless you really know where it's coming from. And anything wild, for that matter, should always be cooked all the way through, just to make sure there are no, you know, no parasites and everything is safe. And because this isn't going to be cooked all the way, I'm going to transfer it right back to the same pan while I head to the next step. Got some caramelization on the backside. I'm going to go ahead and take it out of the pan now. So now that we've got our rabbit sauteed, I'm going to go ahead and add our aromatics. That's going to be we've got a little bit of fresh mint. I actually got that straight out of the garden this morning. Some spring onions. And a little bit of sage. Again, all fresh aromatics that are going to be really nice. Make this dish really flavorful. And with this, all that stuff in the bottom, the crusty stuff, they call that fond. And you don't want to get rid of that. We're actually going to cook this into the remainder of the recipe. So I turned my heat down a little bit as well because I don't want it to burn. I just want to get some nice little crispies in the bottom. You can smell that mint and the sage are really, really pungent. It smells fantastic. This is going to be great with the apples and the rabbit. So now that I've sauteed my aromatics until they are very vibrant and come alive, I've got a few more things to add. I've got some apple cider vinegar, and this is going to help deglaze the bottom of my pan. And I really want to scrape all the stuff off the bottom of the pan, all the fond, because that's going to help make our final sauce. And I'm going to go ahead and add about a half cup of our cornstarch that we made earlier. Got a little bit of maple syrup vinegar. So it's a vinegar that's actually made by fermenting maple syrup. And then it's aged in oak barrels. And then I have some maple syrup itself. And I'm going to bring this up to a simmer. And then I'm going to go ahead and add everything back in, or the apples and the rabbit back into the pot. And don't forget, we've seasoned the meat, but we also want to go ahead and make sure that we season our cooking liquid. not too much. Because remember, this liquid is going to reduce down, and what will happen is we'll actually make it too salty if we season it too much in the beginning. So what I always like to tell people is you want to layer in the seasoning as you're cooking. You know, really let it build. So that way, once you get to the end, you just need a few sprinkles of salt right at the end. Gonna go ahead now and add my apples. Here. Go ahead and add the rabbit in the bottom, and I'll add my apples. Turn this down as well. Because at this point we're going to be doing what's known as braising. And what braising is you are cooking some sort of meat or vegetable in a very flavorful broth. You want it somewhat half covered with the liquid itself, but you also want to cook it in kind of an enclosed container that's going to allow it to steam while it cooks and allow those flavors really to permeate. So next I need to go grab my cover. I'm going to wait for this to come up to a boil. Then I'm going to go ahead and come up to a simmer. Then I'm going to go ahead and just cover it and let it relax for about 30 or 45 minutes. Here we are. We got a nice tight fitting lid. That's going to allow all this to all the flavors to really meld and build over the next 30 minutes. I turned it up just a little bit to get it hot, but I don't want to cook it too hot, because the whole point of braising is a nice slow, very gentle cooking method that's going to allow everything to get tender without overcooking it. So I'm thinking number 3 on this is going to be perfect. I can see some bubbles. I can hear just a very light popping of bubbles, and that's it. Now we cover, and we're going to let the magic happen. This is the hard part. Now we have to sit and wait. Now that the rabbit has been cooking for about 45 minutes, just take a look at that. See how the apples have gotten nice and soft? The rabbit's pulling away from the bone, which means that it's cooked all the way through. And what we're going to do is we're going to baste it just a little bit in this sauce. Then we're going to reduce our sauce just a little bit to get it to a nice consistency. And you see how along the cooking process, it didn't really look like that much sauce, but natural moisture is released from the apples, it's released from the rabbit. This is what you end up with, and these apples are just so tender. You want to be careful not to mess with them too much, because they'll start to fall apart on you. I don't want to keep cooking everything, so what I'm going to do is I've got a nice clean pan here. I'm going to go ahead and take everything out, and I'm going to turn up my sauce now that the top is off, to let it reduce down. Because all along that way with the top covered like that, you don't really have too much water loss. Like I said, you just want to be gentle with everything, because at the end, what you really want is just this nice, beautiful plate with these braised apples, this nice chunks of rabbit. And the French word for what we're looking for in the sauce is actually what's called nappe, N-A-P-P-E. And what that means is essentially just that it can coat the back of a spoon. And it's not too far from being there. So now that the sauce is nice and nappe, we're just going to set it off to the side here while we prepare the last couple bits of the dish. So if you remember, we made some cornmeal, and all I did was once those cooled a little bit, I formed them into small little cakes. Okay, and we're going to sear these off in a little bit more of our sunflower oil. So again, I've got a nice heavy bottom pan that is going to allow me to get nice coloration without just burning because there are hot spots. And I'm going to take a little bit of my sunflower oil here. And when I say a little, I mean really a good bit, because we don't want our cakes to stick. I'm just going to get that nice and hot. I can already see the oil starting to shimmer on there. And when it starts shimmering, that's when you know it's just about where you want it. And these corn cakes, as they cool off, they actually get, they're a little sticky at first, but as they cool off, they get firm enough to where you can handle them. They don't even stick to your fingers at all. That's why we cook them for so long in the process. And there's no magic to forming them up. Mine. This is kind of a rustic dish. This isn't something that is refined and you want all the edges perfect. As I'm searing off these corn cakes, it's bubbling lightly in the pan, which is good for me. And I just want to kind of swirl them around a little bit as they're starting to cook. That way they don't stick. If you just put them in there, walk away, and come back in a couple minutes, what's going to end up happening is they'll stick. So any color you get on them, it's just going to be on the pan and they won't look very nice. See, one of them here is sticking a little bit, but that's okay. We'll forgive him. And you can see the wonderful color that was imparted on these by that juniper ash. It's kind of got a gray-blue hue to them. I just want to keep them moving around in the pan just a little bit to make sure we don't lose all our nice color on them. And as you can see, I got a good bit of oil in here because I'm not trying to fry them, but I am trying to keep them from sticking. And this may be a good opportunity if you want to use like a non-stick pan. But if you do use that non-stick pan, just make sure that you don't use any metallic utensils inside because you'll scrape them up. They do stick a bit. Don't fret, This really last part is just for color, just to make them, give them a little bit of texture. It's not going to ruin anything. Because these are all, how much it sticks right now is all about how much liquid your corn absorbs, all that fun stuff. Just about there on the color we want, then we'll flip them over. Add just little bit of color on them. Now it's time to flip. Yep. The other nice thing about sauteing them is it gives it a nice crispy exterior, which is going to go really nice with that soft rabbit and those soft apples. So now that they're hot all the way through, we've got a little bit of color and texture on the outside. I'm going to go ahead and take them out of the pan. And we're going to do the last part before we can go ahead and enjoy. This last part here, we're just going to saute up some Brussels sprouts with a touch of our maple vinegar and a little bit of maple syrup. And we can do these in the same pan. This is all going to be together on the same plate. If I were at home, I'd probably be doing it in 2 separate pans just so it would be faster. So I've got some Brussels sprouts that I just trimmed off the bottoms and then cut them into quarters. Now, one of the reasons why you trim off the bottom is you want to, it's very woody. I'm going to go ahead and season them with a little bit of salt and pepper. And Brussels sprouts, by far, one of my favorite vegetables. So many people don't like them, or there's this stigma attached to Brussels sprouts because, well, everyone's heard, oh, you got to eat the boiled Brussels sprouts. But if you ever have, a nice sauteed or pan roasted or oven roasted Brussels sprout, they're absolutely fantastic. When they get a little bit of caramelization on the outside, really brings out their sweetness, and they're absolutely fantastic. So now that my Brussels sprouts have picked up a little bit of color and they're nice and soft, I'm going to go ahead and hit them with just a touch of maple vinegar and a little bit of maple syrup, because that sweetness and that acidity is going to be really nice for them. And you want to add these liquids at the very end, because if you don't, they'll end up burning on the bottom of the pan because you've been cooking them for too long. Gosh, if y'all could smell this, it smells fantastic. And there you go, some nice, super quick, super simple maple roasted Brussels sprouts. And now we're on to the fun part, plating. The plating. This is a chef's favorite part of any dish, because this is where we get to have a little bit of fun. What I'm going to do here, we're going to take a couple of our corn cakes, put them down. A few of my nice maple roasted Brussels sprouts. I'm going to take one of my nice saddles, these beautiful hind legs, and then just a few of our roasted apples as a nice little garnish. All those work so well together. The corn, the Brussels sprouts. And the piece de la resistance, the sauce. This is where all that mint and maple vinegar, and maple syrup and apple cider and cornstarch, where everything just kind of finally comes in and rounds the rest out. There you have it. The completed recipe from Chef Sean Sherman and Beth Dooley's book, The Sous Chef's Indigenous Kitchen. And I hope you'll stop by the library, pick up a copy just like I did, and maybe you'll celebrate Native American Heritage Month by cooking a few of the recipes. So, thank you for being with us today, and I look forward to seeing you next time.